Tēnā koutou katoa, tuatahi he mihi ki te whenua, he mihi ki ngā maunga, he mihi ki ngā wai, he mihi ki ngā tāngata whenua o tēnei rohe ngā Okanagan. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, ko tai mai I tēnei ahiai. Greetings firstly to the land, to the mountains, to the waters, and to the traditional peoples of this land, and greetings to all of you who have come this afternoon, and thank you for having us. I'm going to just basically talk to some points around the intellectual project of decolonising methodologies. I'm going to talk to some images and I'm going to read you a few short pieces, just give a sense, I think, of ways of thinking about theory and theory around both the decolonising methodologies agenda and Indigenous methodologies, because I do see those as running together. But let me start first with ko waio, who am I? In our culture, actually, we don't ask who are you, we ask where are you from, and this is where half of me is from. A mountain called Hikurangi and a river called Waiapu, and then two images there, one taken from offshore by Hoturoa Kerr, who's one of our great revivalists of the ocean-going waka, and the other one in the top right-hand image is of the same mountain from the back of our farm. And then on the bottom photo is of my family homestead. So I come from a valley, which sort of is a little bit like the Okanagan, but the valley opens up to the ocean, and it's fairly rural and isolated. So that's on my mother's side. I don't have a beautiful picture of the mountain on my father's side, but the name of that mountain is Putauaki, the name of the river is the Rangitaiki, and the name of the people is Ngāti Awa. And so in our culture we take bilineal descent from both parents, and we have that as our whakapapa, our genealogy, our right to be part of those peoples. And that makes us where we're from, and where we're from makes us who we are. And much of, I think, my work has been trying to kind of understand much more deeply about what it means to be from the land, and what it means to be from a mountain, what it means to have relationships with land and waters, with mountains and valleys, and why that paradigm of knowing is so important in reclaiming who we are as an Indigenous people, but also as a paradigm of knowing the world, of being able to live a contemporary life with this as an embedded paradigm in our minds, in the way we see the world. So that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about today. So really what I want to talk about, I like to strip things down to their simple components. And it's, you know, how did we get from where we once were through the sort of colonisation phase, through the decolonisation phase, and back, if you like, to some notion of what it means to be Indigenous. How does that actually work in the world? How does that work socially? How does that work in our communities? Because just what's represented here in these book titles is, it's one thing to theorise it, but it's another thing to know the complexities, that it's not just saying to people, all right, tomorrow you're decolonised, and you can live a decolonised life. You know, what does that mean? And if we turn to, you know, some of the theorists, revisited Frantz Fanon last night, and, you know, when you strip him back, he says the role of, I guess, native intellectuals in terms of colonialism is to get rid of colonialism. All right? That's our role, is to dismantle it. If you read Paulo Freire, you know, he asks us to do something else, which is to, as well as dismantle it, humanise our oppressor. That the role of the oppressed in some, you know, in a way, is also to humanise the oppressor. And what that does, I think, is put on us as Indigenous peoples a huge responsibility. But it also recognises that sort of position of oppressor and oppressed, coloniser and colonised, that these are relationships that only exist in relation to each other. That you, in order to have a colonised people, there's a coloniser. In order to have a coloniser, there's a colonised. So these are kind of fundamental relationships that, you know, theoretically we have to tease apart and understand. But if I turn to some of our Indigenous leaders, and from our own community, I think they're a little bit more realistic, because, you know, one of our great chiefs said, our struggle is without end. That what we've inherited, if you like, through colonisation, through colonialism, is a struggle that will go on forever and ever. Ka whawhai tōni mātou, ake tōnu ake. And when I talk to our young people about that, you know, half of them think, oh my God, it's like, is there no end to this? Is there no, like, happy place that we're going to be able to go to? And then the other ones say, yeah, that's it. You know, and so it seems like a dark and depressing picture. But I tell them, I can't imagine any other life. Right, so to me, you know, when I wake up in the morning, it's going, yeah, you know, this is our life. This is what gives it purpose. And it's not a depressing duty. It's an honour. It's uplifting. It's positive. And it's a way of being that has come to us and that we have to engage in. So I just want to talk you down just a few experiences which might explain why I might think like that. So in another life I was also a political activist as an undergraduate student in the 1970s, when most of my current undergraduate students had not yet been born. So they are rather surprised that we're alive. But, you know, the 70s was here in Canada and the US as well, was a time of, you know, questioning around civil rights and American Indian rights, First Nations rights, anti-Vietnam War, feminism, gay and lesbian rights. So it was that kind of era that I happened to come into as a young person and as a student at university. And so I joined a group called Ngā Tamatoa, which was one of the leading activist groups for the honouring of our treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi. We had about three main sort of aims. I say three because we'll say we did a lot of other things as well. One was about the treaty, one was about our language, and one was just about our rights in general. But as one of my former colleagues reminded me, they also just wanted to have a fight because we were an angry generation. We were a generation who felt that that the whole sort of assimilation of our culture had left us landless, languageless, and identityless, and that was not a good space to be in. And there was no hope in that space for us. In other words, we're just dying. So for us, hopefulness was around the resurrection or the claiming and assertion of rights, the revitalisation of our language and culture, and certainly the honouring of a treaty that our ancestors had signed in good faith as sovereign peoples with the British Crown. And so, given where we were from and the context that we came out of, these things provided us not just with this moral sense of rights and obligations that needed to be honoured, but the sense that we could change that. We could actually make that happen. It wasn't some pie-in-the-sky vision, but the only way it would happen is if we stood up and if we made it happen. And that was very important, not just a political stand, it was an important psychological kind of moment to believe we could change our circumstances, to believe that we could assert things that most of society and most of our own people had given up on. And in that era, in the 1970s, that was the situation. Most of our own people had given up on that hope. They had it and they talked about it around the kitchen table, but they'd stopped acting as if it could be real. And I think the role of activists often is to try and make things real, to act, not just to talk around the table and hope someone acts, but to actually go and do it. And obviously that's kind of a messy process. And for our group it was extremely messy for lots of different reasons, but we were also up against our own conservative communities. Right, so a lot of our communities didn't like what we were doing and rejected us. They actually tried to ban us from marae or community settings and hissed at us and spat at us and swore at us, and you know, the whole term Māori radical was seen as a very negative label. Right, that if you were labelled as a Māori radical, there was something fundamentally wrong with you. Now that's changed, that term. Now, you know, there are a lot of people who claim to be in this group, and we're going, actually, we weren't that large a group. We're actually quite a small group, and we do know who was a member of it. But because it happened so long ago, people are thinking that, you know, it had a cast of thousands. So I just want to give you a sense of that, because our students now tend to romanticise what it meant to be a radical in the 1970s, and tend to romanticise activism. And I think if there's one thing I learned in terms of my understanding of decolonisation, is it's not romantic. It's very messy. And it hurts people. People can be hurt, people hurt each other. And you make mistakes. And some of what you seek, you find is not what you really seek. It's not what you, there's something else behind the door. So you're sort of groping, grappling with, and trying to reach something that you can't quite imagine, you can't quite see, but you know that it has to exist. and it's a message you have to try and give to others, and they're going, what? You don't know what you're aiming for. And we're going, what we do, we just can't describe what it looks like. You just have to go on that journey, because we know what's through there is better than what we have now. We just know that. All right, so trying to sell that kind of message in an activist context can be really difficult. And often the ones who join up are ones who somehow get that dream. Or some of them, as you'll see, they don't really get the dream, but they want to be part of the journey. So I'll just read you something. I'm not claiming here to be a POET. I put some words together to try and express what I think a bit of that activism was like. And I've called this the Easter show. I'm not sure if you have Easter shows here, but in New Zealand the Easter show is when all the farmers turn up with their, you know, fat lambs and fat calves and bulls and, you know, agricultural products, and then there's side shows and you've got the clowns with the big mouths going, trying to throw balls in, and so it's a huge family event called the Easter show. And this was in Auckland. 5 of us women turned up, parked down the street a bit, sat on the grass verge with placards saying, "Honour the treaty, give back our land." Another carload was bringing posters, the megaphone and lunch, we hoped. 6 cops turned up too, parked nearer the intersection where they could block off access. 1 marked car, 2 unmarked, 2 suits, 4 uniformed. Made us smile. Meant they had listened in on us, so now we knew. They seemed wary of us women. We enjoyed watching them watching us. And then we got sick of them and turned our backs. Couple of Māori cops, they knew our names. "You should be ashamed," one hissed at us. We ignored his taunt. Then 3 of our mates turned up, supposed to be our strategic warriors. Parallel parked right beside one of the unmarked cop cars, blocking the road. Fell out of the car, scruffy and hung over, late. No posters, no sign of phone, of food, no megaphone, of course. Bloody unreliable, typical. We ran out of petrol. They took in the cops and sauntered across the road. We were armed with our outrage, our intent, our voices, and our drunk mates. The cops nonchalantly, casually, on purpose, hands in pockets, fanned out, looking every which way except our way, crossing the road. 2 to the left of us, 2 to the right. 1 suit stayed in his car, the other inspected our car. "Your car is illegally parked," the uniform said. "It's on our fucking land. You need to move it now. Get your pig cars off our fucking land. You are blocking public access. This is Māori land. There is no public land. You are obstructing a public road. You are trespassing on Māori land. Come on, this is the Easter show. This is no fucking Easter show. This is invasion of our land, pig." The pig thing did it. The cop in the car opened his door. The cop near our car made a move, the sound of smashing glass on his side of the road. There was no assault on a pig, unless he oinked himself. No damaging a cop car by us. No resisting arrest. Hell, we demanded arrest. Come on, arrest us. They only wanted the one who said pig, so they could beat him up, because he said it before and it pissed them off. So he said it again and again. Our other car turned up with our legal expert. Expert in being arrested multiple times. Never got convicted. Pigs hated him too. He was a smart ass. because he knew our rights. He nodded at the suits and they met him behind the unmarked car. We were wanting recognition of the treaty and the return of our lands. They wanted an apology for calling them pigs, and they wanted 10 minutes to beat someone up. Just get in the car, our expert ordered us. The window smashed. Doesn't matter, get in the car. We got in our cars, hanging the placards out the windows like oars. What's pink goes oink oink and rolls in shit, someone said. More negotiation occurred behind the car. Okay, keep your mouth shut and get out of here. The expert made out he was in charge of us. Oh, piss off, one of us said. Then we staged one of our internal arguments. Jesus, you women need to shut your mouths. Well, you need to stop talking to the white man. The pigs loved it. They relaxed, got in their cars. A minor event in the scheme of things, a practice run for the big one. So just the sense of it wasn't all sort of political protest. It was, in a sense, also about testing the boundaries of what we could do. And I think when I look back in time, and also, you know, and reading some of the theory around political resistance, you don't often know what those boundaries are until you push them. And then you learn the boundary is not the political message. The boundary is the rhetorical message of the pig word. You know, that what you're pushing up against is not necessarily these formally sort of understood political values or mainstream values. They're often these soft human aspects that cause the police and other institutions of power to retaliate. It's actually kind of it's a subtle thing, but what causes someone else to retaliate is when you hit them in their vulnerable part. And their vulnerable bits are not necessarily these comfortable sort of structures of power that are embedded in them. It's the soft parts they didn't know they actually had, the parts that make them vulnerable. So just moving on, I guess one of the big aspects of our sort of revitalisation and our sort of move towards decolonisation in New Zealand has been about building our own capacity. So if we, you know, if we go back to Fanon's message, we've got to dismantle colonialism. We've also got to see through what gets built after colonialism. And the message also that Fanon talks about is actually, you know, and it's the story of many post-colonial countries after World War II, is the post-colonial structures they built look very much like the pre-colonial or the colonial structures that existed, that they inherit the same legal system, same political system, same land property rights system. And so trying to contest colonial structures while imagining a different structure is incredibly challenging. And I think the gift of Indigenous peoples is we already have in place the imagination of different structures. We already have in place the imagination of different forms of governance, of different relationships to the earth, because that's what we had prior to colonisation. And so the importance of the Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous knowledge piece is coming through with a different paradigm for living. And I think Indigenous political groups have a clearer vision about what's possible that doesn't base itself on colonial structures, right? we know there's a different form of governance than what we've got now. We know that there are different constitutional relationships between peoples, between people and the earth, between people and the environment than what exists now. And so part of our other journey around Indigenous methodologies has been trying to bring forth and make sense in this world what those different paradigms of knowledge might be like. And so I think we're having to do both things simultaneously, and building the capacity in our own communities to help us build not only the bridge between what we're trying to reject and where we're trying to go to, but build the intellectual capacity in our own communities that enable us to do that. And Graham, I'm sure, will talk to more of that in his talk. So I just want to go back to this very old diagram. I don't really draw many diagrams. I'm not a diagram person. But it was my attempt some time ago to just put down in some sort of conceptual framework what I could see different Indigenous peoples trying to do, and often all at the same time. So some are simply trying to survive physically, and we can also say that's true today, that there are Indigenous peoples just trying to survive. Many of them are absolutely on the margins of the societies that they live in. Some of them are still being hunted. Some of them are still having their lands ripped out from under them. Others are kind of moving forward, if you like, and are sort of talking about their recovery and revitalisation. And others, and I would put Māori in this category, and probably First Nations as well, are sort of thinking more about development and how do we sort of build these new futures that we're imagining. And all have a dream of being self-determining, and have this kind of notion of somehow that if we gain self-determination, we'll have greater control of our lives and of the way that we choose to live. But inside it also these other sort of processes of trying to mobilise. So while I'm speaking here, in Toronto is the World Conference, what is it? The World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, which is huge and which has been going for many years. And that's sort of trying to connect what we're doing in our own jurisdictions with what Indigenous peoples around the world are trying to do, has been sort of one of the big moves of the 1990s and the sort of early part of the 21st century, is trying to connect our struggles. And by doing that, you know, the biggest gain, I guess you could argue, is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that it's come about because of the mobilisation of Indigenous peoples worldwide. When I come to Canada, and often also in Australia, we hear a different discourse. We hear the word healing more here in Canada than in New Zealand. We also hear the word reconciliation, and sort of, you know, it's an interesting word to me as a Māori to figure out what is meant by reconciliation here in Canada. But we do use it at home. It's just not the dominant sort of discourse. The dominant discourse at home at the moment is called treaty settlements, and this post-treaty settlement world where our tribes are negotiating settlements with the Crown. I guess what I would just say from this picture, however, is much of what we're trying to do is work simultaneously across multiple sites, trying to move things at different levels, at different paces or different speed, at different scales, and that can be kind of exhausting. But it can also be very fragmented unless we sort of keep this vision clear about what we're trying to achieve. So I'm now going to move into just 3 projects I'm currently working on. This one is nearly finished, but I'm working with a tribe that's not my own tribe, and that was rather interesting for me. So with Whakatohea, a tribe in the sort of central eastern North Island of New Zealand. And so we sort of developed this concept about what they were trying to achieve, and conceptually what are the different projects that they would hang off it. And let me see if these are right here. Yeah. So their vision was really about this concept of well-being. What does it mean to be well? And not just thinking about it in a health sense, but in a holistic sense. And so what we identified is there's a whole kind of work, and here we use the word reconciliation, which is how do they settle their treaty claims? How do they come to some reconciliation with society? The next one was how do they revitalise culture, regenerate culture, and it's something this iwi are very strong on. Another one is around the sort of intergenerational development. So we can't just talk about development as some sort of progressive, modernist sort of journey of improving ourselves, because often development also means assimilation, or development can mean, you know, we're just trying to mirror a capitalist form of development, whereas a lot of what we're trying to do is this kind of rebuilding intergenerational strengths, intergenerational responsibilities and connections. And then, you know, as we move through that, what the tribe wanted to do was ultimately, when we broke everything down, was how do they as a tribe actually practice hospitality. And not hospitality in sort of Derrida sense of the word, hospitality in their sense of the world, of how can they be generous to others. And you know, it's an interesting thing that a lot of our rural tribes are very generous, even though they have very little. They'll put all their food from the cupboard on the table to share with visitors, because the value of manaakitanga or hospitality is held very highly in our culture. But what they're saying here is, wouldn't it be great to be able to share with your visitors the best of what you have, and also have stuff left over for yourselves? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great to produce all this food that we can ensure that our people are well fed and have enough left over to feed our visitors? So this sort of sense of hospitality, when they sort of try to crystallise what would we be like, what if we go through these kind of phases of, you know, decolonising, what kind of people would we be? And so what they said is, well, they want to be people who can practice generosity, who are hospitable, who have kai or food or resources, and that is collectively produced and collectively distributed and collectively shared. So that's how they saw their vision. And in the end, it wasn't really about, you know, just doing that. It was how do you transfer this idea of well-being into a way of being. And so that was their vision, and then we went through a number of sort of categories here. How do we grow leadership? Oh, where's my arrow? There. You know, how do we grow the leadership of the tribe to take them forward? How do we grow the capacity of individuals, get them educated? How do we build the capability of the tribal organisations, the infrastructure? How do we build community engagement? Because even though we think you know, our tribes have got good hospitality and we're all related to each other, it doesn't mean that we're fully engaged with everyone in the community. We have a lot of, you know, like we have a high suicide rate amongst our people. So how do we engage our youth in this vision? How do we then strengthen our extended families? And how do we strengthen our sort of governance, our collective decision making? So this was the sort of matrix that we worked on, and what they then did as a tribe, independent of me, is identified 4 action research projects, and you'll see this one here, a sort of healing from trauma. Whakatohea is a tribe that has underwent confiscations of land by the government, by the Crown, and so they're in a process of trying to sort of heal themselves from what that meant for them as a tribe, because it meant, you know, it actually means people being turfed off their land. It actually means a dispossession of land, but they still live in that place. So they every day see the land that they were turfed off. And I suspect that would resonate here. They have a cultural development strategy for regenerating culture. They have a whole kind of land assessment project of looking at, is there a way they can re-collectivise land? Are there some other tools they could use to ensure that what little bits of land they have, they can use for more collective kind of outcomes? But their other strategy is they're buying back land. So every time a farm comes up for sale, they're looking at whether they can buy it. And then they're practicing hospitality. They're starting to run sort of celebration festivals, because we're good at coming together for grief. When someone dies, when something bad happens, our people are wonderful at just mobilising. We can put on great funerals, but we stopped celebrating, you know, positive things. We stopped knowing how to celebrate, knowing how to just celebrate because that's a cool thing to do. You know, people feel guilty about celebrating and taking time out to enjoy each other. And so they put on a festival, and what they did was invite all the non-Indigenous part of the business community to participate as well, so that it's a wider concept. So that's just one project that has come to an end. Well, it's come to an end in terms of my role as a researcher, but for the tribe, or the iwi, they're going forward with their projects, and they're going into treaty settlement negotiations. So this is our second project. I'm part of a team that's looking at trauma-informed care approaches. I noticed that it's in the Canadian Health and Social Service language as well. So it's a kind of new best thing for social service provision. And when the Ministry of Social Development and Ministry of Health at home, you know, put this out, this is what our providers have to provide for, you know, they were thinking like, how do you provide trauma-informed services for somebody who's had a traffic accident, you know, and they've been hurt and they're traumatised from that. But when you talk to our people and they see the word trauma, they think, yeah, colonisation, how do we like heal from colonisation? So you've got 2 completely different discourses going on, with our providers thinking this is an opportunity for us to do intergenerational healing, to address some of the trauma that's come from colonisation, and you have the Ministry of Health saying we're paying you X amount of dollars to deal with X amount of clients, and after 4 sessions they'll be healed. You know, so in other words, 2 different discourses. So this project is working with a team. I'm part of a team where we're trying to develop a sort of what we call a Kaupapa Māori approach to trauma-informed care that helps us build and document the evidence base for what our providers are doing, but also helps to educate the ministries about the broader possibilities of this model. And just as some examples, you know, if you look at the trauma literature, it talks really about an individual. And it talks about an individual being a victim. So the victim is an individual. But in a kaupapa Māori or Māori cultural framework, the victim is never just an individual. The victim is a wider whānau and a community. And so how do you build that notion into the provision of services? Also, you know, the mainstream literature talks about empowerment of the individual. The aim is you empower individuals. Whereas in our framework is you empower an extended group who will empower the individual and who will ensure that the individual is kept safe. And our word for that is, you know, the mana of an individual, that you nurture and support the mana of an individual. But the mana of an individual can't exist in isolation from the mana of a group, their collective group. So, you know, all the way through, when we apply our own paradigm, our own way of thinking about these things, we come up with a completely different model. And many of our providers intuitively try to enact this model. But in terms of their contract with the ministry, they're given X amount of dollars for X amount of interactions for an outcome that is measurable in terms of saying, this person, you can give them a tick in the box, they're now healed. All right? And so for us, that notion of healing is an ongoing, collective responsibility. There are some things you never really get over, like you can't get over colonisation. You don't just get over it. You have to address it, right? You lick your wounds, you repair your wounds, but then the greater mission is how do you change the system that created the wound? And that's, you know, I guess that's what our providers are all trying to do. So that project, we're in the process of that, and for me it's been fantastic going around the country visiting all our organisations. So the last project that I want to talk to is kind of understanding Indigenous knowledge and what it means. If you look in the literature, there's been an explosion of literature around Indigenous knowledge. Lots of people are talking about Indigenous knowledge. And so I guess my role is to think, okay, this is interesting, it's becoming sort of an academic discourse. So what does that mean for our knowledge, which is produced in our community by people who don't necessarily see themselves as academics? What does it mean when it gets lifted into an academic world? What are academics doing to it? You know, when we apply methodology, so I don't know if you can see the title, oops. I use the word mayhem. Indigenous knowledge, methodology and mayhem. What is the role of methodology in producing Indigenous insights? So in that paper we just ask some questions around what it means to apply these Western disciplinary notions to Indigenous knowledge. What does it mean for the way we understand that knowledge? In the Māori sense, it's not just about knowledge, it's about ways of knowing. It's also about ways of being. And what does it mean for our knowledge producers? Right, are our knowledge producers now going to be just academics? Or our knowledge producers, the ones in our community who live by our calendar, who plant by our traditional calendar, who fish by our calendar, who are navigators, who carvers, our artists, what does it mean when we try and do those things? So, you know, that's kind of just an example of 3 sort of contemporary pieces of research that I'm working on that just try and kind of make sense of where we're going, what is it, how are we carrying through our vision, what do we have to build that's new, what do we have to dismantle, what do we have to delegitimate, what do we have to legitimate as the world that we're trying to create. And so I know a lot of people aren't interested in that sort of thing. I'm really interested in that sort of thing. That's what I think about when I'm in a plane and, you know, I'm sitting there, right, what do we do next? What sort of things do we chew at? And if you can think of an apple, you know, a lot of my work is just about biting around the apple and trying to get to the core of what does it mean to create and participate in a decolonised world. What does it mean for us as an Indigenous community to be in that world? Because we've been transformed by colonisation. We can't go back to the way we were in the 18th century. Most of our young people don't want to be back there. They love technology, they love the sense of being part of this global environment, they like shopping. You know, they've got some sort of material sort of aspirations. So what does it mean to be Indigenous in a contemporary world? What does it mean to fulfil our mission, if you like, our vision as Indigenous peoples, but to go forward as transformed, right? We've been transformed by colonisation in a way that we can't go back to that. And so that's a big question that I will continue to ask and continue to observe in what we do and also in the kinds of research that we do. So I just want to finish there, and I think hopefully that leaves time for questions and discussions. So thank you.